Hi, and welcome to the Transformational CEO Forum. I'm Robert Reiss, and with my co-host, Ganesh Iyer, we're speaking with the CEOs who have reinvented themselves and their businesses to succeed in the digital age. Our guest today is Dr. Steve Corwin from NewYork-Presbyterian.
Thanks, Robert. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, good to meet you.
So let's start off with your personal journey. What did you learn growing up that shaped the way you view leadership?
I think the most important experience I had, believe it or not, was as a 12 or 13-year-old, I started to caddy at a local golf club. You learn a lot about people. You learn a lot about being in a subservient position. You're caddying with other people from various backgrounds, races, ethnicities, religions. It was eye-opening. And I think the thing it taught me most is when you're in a position where you are subservient to somebody, you expect to be treated a certain way and with a certain amount of respect. And it carried over throughout my adult life, and it's carried over into my being the CEO. It was a really eye-opening experience, let's put it that way.
Very interesting, Dr. Corwin. And let me add my welcome. You are in healthcare business which really touches people. I want to hear your perspective as you look around the digital technology, digital transformation. Could you share with us at a personal level, what was that aha moment which made you think, okay, I need to embark on a journey of personal transformation and embracing technology?
I love interacting with people. One of the great pleasures in my life was the ability to, as a physician, interact with patients, interact with people. And as I said to you, this experience with caddying was extremely important for me in terms of how do you relate to other people? How do you relate to who they are, where they came from, what their problems might be? I think that, as I've developed as a physician, I felt that a leadership role was really important for me because I wanted to translate those values into how do we care for people. What became apparent to me as we started to get more and more into digital was that you could use digital to transform that experience. And one of the most interesting insights we've had is that we do a program on telepsychiatry. So you can come to an emergency room somewhere in the region. And it's very difficult oftentimes to get a psychiatrist. I'm blessed being part of New-York-Presbyterian with having a lot of psychiatrists from Columbia and Cornell on staff. They can come to our emergency room, see patients who have psychiatric need. But as you go into the region, that's often not the case. We made the decision that we were going to do telepsychiatry, that we would take our psychiatrists from Columbia and Weill Cornell and allow them to see patients in a far-off regional hospital. I was very concerned about that. Think about being a psychiatric patient and you're paranoid, you're worried about things. How will you respond to that digital experience of seeing a psychiatrist virtually? And the answer is patients really appreciate it. You could dramatically reduce the time it took to see a psychiatrist, and the patients really responded to that. We're not talking about patients who are mildly depressed. We're talking about seriously psychiatrically disturbed patients. And it sort of opened up that window to me that digital really is the future of medicine. Think about another example. Your mother, your father, your sister has heart failure. You have to take off from work to be able to take that relative to the doctor. It takes 30 minutes to get that patient dressed. You have to drive into the city. You have to pay for parking. You have to make sure there's a wheelchair to be able to wheel your relative up from the parking lot to the doctor's office. It takes 10 minutes to get your relative undressed in the doctor's office for a 10-minute visit. Imagine if you could do that at home, and we're doing that.
Interesting.
And you can take care of a heart failure patient. All the technology exists, and I can say, Mrs. Jones, what's your weight like today? Let me listen to your heart and lungs. Let me see your legs. Over in 5 minutes. Think about the productivity advantage that has. Amazing. So digital is a transformation, in my opinion.
Yep. And your business model is probably unique because you literally have two sets of customers, doctors and patients. And as a CEO, could you kind of let us into you as a person and share with us what values, how you bring about change in the organization, how do you transform the hospital by you becoming a role model as a CEO? Could you kind of give a personal glimpse into it?
Let me take a little bit of exception to your description. I think there is only one customer,
Okay.
and that is the patient.
Right.
And that's the galvanizing principle. I'm fortunate in healthcare that we're not making widgets. We're taking care of people. And if you say, look, the galvanizing principle for us is, what do we need to do to take great care of a patient? Everybody signs on to that. Doctors, nurses, food service workers. And that's the really important thing that we stress. It's about the patient. If we take great care of the patient, then derivative from that, nurses are going to be treated well, physicians are going to be treated well, but that's got to be the galvanizing principle. And oftentimes when we get into conflict, should we do this or should we do that, the principle you always go back to is, what's the right thing to do for the patient? I mentioned before this issue around having that ethos, around feeling that interpersonal connection is important. And I found more and more as a CEO that it really is about personally connecting as the leader to the people that you're leading. Strategy is important, but that personal connection, that people will run through walls for the organization because they believe in what the organization is doing, I think is indispensable.
Could you give an example of how someone would run through walls?
I'll give you a perfect example of that. We have a very advanced heart failure and heart transplant program. Antecedent to getting a heart transplant, many patients have mechanical heart devices put in. We had an occurrence, this is a couple of years ago now, where a patient was driving up to upstate New York, had the mechanical device in place, and had to get pulled over to the side of the road because the mechanical device was malfunctioning. Now, a malfunctioning mechanical device like that can result in death.
Right.
There is the ability for a period of time, an hour or so, where you can manually affect that pump. They called to, this is over a weekend, they're in upstate New York, they called to the program director. Two of the nurses drove out an hour and a half outside of the city, they weren't on duty, to take care of that patient, take care of the malfunction, and bring the patient back. Wow. That, to me, is just extraordinary.
Outstanding. Absolutely outstanding. Now, the field of healthcare is undergoing tremendous transformation.
Sure.
Computational biology, computational chemistry, robotics. I mean, you can go on and on and on as to how technology is getting into the sphere of healthcare. People are predicting that the life can be extended to 200 years. How do you keep yourself personally updated with these changes, these transformation, startups, new areas? What do you do?
Well, first, I'm not sure I want to live for 200 years. I take 100.
Okay.
But you're right. I think that there are opportunities to extend life. I think there are a few things. First, you cannot know it all. You have to surround yourself. You have to be confident enough as the leader to say, this is the direction we're going in. I've got to surround myself with people who are really expert in various areas and learn enough to say, this makes sense or this doesn't make sense. I think that especially with things like computational biology, big data, precision medicine, how does robotics advance, you have to rely on the most expert physicians, the most expert information technology people, and then probe them. But ultimately, you have to rely on advice. I want to move in this direction. Show me how to do that. And sometimes you have to take the leap of faith of, I trust this person. I've worked with this person. This person thinks this field is going in this direction. We're going to place a bet on that. I'll give you a perfect example of that.
But we're going to hear that example after the break. We're with Dr. Steve Corwin. When we come back, we'll hear that example. We'll also hear of how he transferred from being a physician to a CEO. Back in a few. back on the Transformational CEO Forum with Dr. Steve Corwin. You are going to tell us a story about cardiac.
Many people know that we've developed the transcatheter aortic valve. So you can be a patient with severe aortic valve disease that leads to death, and some of these patients are not capable of having an open heart operation. We invested in this transcatheter approach with some of the physicians that felt passionately that this approach was going to pay off. That was a decade-long process, and you have to have conviction that this is the way the field is going to go. Now, I'm a cardiologist by training. I was dubious about, would this procedure really work? You get people who have conviction. You decide that you're going to put the chips to the center of the table, and you take a chance on some of this. And this has been a game-changing technology now in the treatment of cardiac disease.
Interesting. Since you mentioned that you're a cardiologist, I would love to hear your story of journey from being a cardiologist to a successful CEO.
Well, I wouldn't recommend it to most people, but when I went into practice in cardiology, the then chairman of medicine said to me, look, you kind of have to do something other than be a cardiologist. So why don't you become the director of the coronary care unit? And that led to being a director of multiple intensive care units. And I realized at that point in time there was a lot more to medicine than just taking care of patients. I had a great knowledge of clinical care, what was good care, what was bad care. I had no knowledge whatsoever of the business of medicine and how impactful it is in terms of how a hospital can run. So I had to teach myself accounting. I had to go to courses to teach I didn't know how to read a balance sheet. I didn't know how to do simple accounting. I didn't know how to do a business plan. I didn't know the basics of project management. I didn't know the basis of, how do you develop effective teams. All of those things I sort of had to learn on the fly. I wouldn't recommend it to people, but I found it an enlightening journey from being somebody taking care of an individual patient to somebody who had the knowledge to be able to take care of a large business. And it was very instructive. It gives you tremendous appreciation for the responsibilities one has to manage an organization effectively, operationally, financially, as well as ultimately how does that distill down to taking care of a patient.
Interesting. And, I want you to touch a little bit about culture. You did mention that patient at the center of everything, which is very heartening to know. You have multiple hospitals. You do inorganic acquisitions, if I may. Can you touch a little bit about how do you ensure that there is consistent culture and people get immersed in that culture? Your brand value is experienced by your patients and your doctors and your employees.
Well, first, you cannot over-communicate. Second, you have to be sincere about what you really believe. What are your values? Do people believe that those values you espouse are what you really are like? Third, I've learned this along the way. Our aspiration is to be the very best hospital and hospital system in the world. And oftentimes you look at people who have succeeded in that realm and you try to replicate who they are and what they are. A perfect example is the Mayo Clinic is a terrific place. Most people would say maybe the top place in the country. We can't replicate the Mayo Clinic at NewYork-Presbyterian. We're not in Rochester, Minnesota. It took me a while to realize that what you have to do when you're in New York, as an example, is embrace what New York is. And so we have to embrace diversity of gender, ethnicity, race, religion, etc., and say this is a New York way of approaching this business. And that foundation comes from, we're going to have a foundation of respect in our culture, respect from where everybody is coming from, and that's going to make us unique. And I think that, to me, that's the most important contribution that I could make to New-York-Presbyterian.
Dr. Corwin, digital is changing healthcare in almost every way you can imagine.
Yes.
If you look forward, say, over the next 5-10 years, what are the biggest changes you see how digital will change the field of healthcare?
I think it's dramatic. I think telemedicine will transform the field. It's got a potential.
And just define telemedicine for everyone.
Perhaps a better term would be digital health. So, second opinions digitally. doing radiology readings digitally, doing pathology readings digitally. We talked about psychiatry consults digitally, chronic care visits digitally. We believe that that will dramatically impact both cost and productivity. And that's the way that people want to experience things. You have to remember, at least from my standpoint, what I tell our employees is, look, think about your experience with Amazon. Now think about what the patient experience is at our hospital. Huge gulf between those two experiences.
Right.
So I think that as digital moves into healthcare, the question is going to be, how do you replicate that experience in a healthcare-centric way? And I think that it will happen. And if you're not there, the wave is going to pass you by. So yes, there will be bricks and mortar, but there has to be this digital revolution. A perfect example is the registration process in a hospital for surgery. We believe that that should be 90% of that should be done online at home, so that when you come into the hospital, people know who you are, where you're going. You get up there, boom, done.
Interesting.
So I think that that will be transformational. Healthcare has lagged, but also you have to remember that, at least in my estimation, the digital revolution has been appropriately but extremely consumer-centric in terms of it's transformed the consumer experience. It has not yet transformed the healthcare experience, and I think that that will happen. At least the healthcare vertical, it hasn't happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're now into a rapid-fire question
Okay.
round. So, Dr. Corwin, I'm going to throw out some words, and you tell me what comes to mind in a quick phrase or sentence.
Sure.
Virtual reality.
Game-changing.
Digital revolution.
Foundational, but not yet reached its peak.
Digital 2050.
Dominant.
Culture.
Essential.
Boy, you know these like the heart. You are set. Customer.
Patient.
Cognitive.
I think cognitive dissonance is something that every CEO needs to pay attention to.
You've about a minute left. Talk about that.
Well, I think that you get various inputs all the time. And there is the element that where when cognitive dissonance occurs, where you realize that there is a disconnect between what you perceived reality to be and what the reality actually is. And I think that that's what a CEO needs to pay attention to. One of my board members, a former CEO, a terrific person, said to me, Steve, your job as the CEO is to hear the bad news and find the bad news. Finding the bad news is at the essence cognitive dissonance. Where is that bad news?
Any advice to aspiring CEOs?
Follow your heart, work hard, and make sure you understand what your business is.
Dr. Corwin, a pleasure having you
Absolutely.
on the Transformational CEO Forum.
Thank you both. I really appreciate it.
Appreciate it.